Hello everyone, it's Dr. Paul Rose again, and in this short presentation I'd like to talk to you about husbandry of passerine birds. Passerines are the most diverse and the largest order of birds that you can find in the aves family tree. And behind me I've got my three Gouldian finches. Gouldian finches are a small type of finch from Australia, and they've got the typical perching bird foot setup of 3 forward-facing toes and 1 backwards-facing toe that allows them to grip onto perches. Don't worry, I don't normally keep them with the door wide open. It's just to give you a better view of what I'm talking about whilst I'm doing this introduction. I've got one male, he's the bird currently in the middle, and I've got 2 females. They're looking a bit scruffier than him because they've just gone into their molt. And the Gouldian finch is really interesting, not only from a behavioural point of view, but also from a conservation point of view as well. Because in the wild, this is actually an incredibly threatened species. It's quite common in aviculture, bird collections, but it's of conservation concern. And it's particularly threatened by human activities and changes to its environment.
The Gouldian finch is interesting because in the wild it can occur in 3 colour forms: a red-headed form, a black-headed form, and a yellow or orange-headed form. And you can see these 3 colour types in this photograph. Not only do they look different, but they also behave differently too. Red-headed birds are more aggressive and are more susceptible to social stresses. Black-headed birds are less aggressive and are generally more relaxed with life. The yellow-headed bird is incredibly uncommon in the wild, and recent research has attempted to unpick the genetic linkages for this yellow head, but has been unable to identify the genes that are involved. The social complexities of these different colour morphs have real conservation and avicultural impacts. Personally, I'm not a fan of colour mutations, particularly when a bird is already as beautiful as the Gouldian finch. But its genetics has been extensively studied, and breeders have completed pedigrees that show you what colours will be produced by different mixings of the original wild colour patterns. And this poster shows you the extent of colours that can be bred from the 3 original wild phenotypes. Showing and bird displays of Gouldian finches are common, and the large genetic population within captivity, if we ignore all of these colour morphs, may have some conservation relevance into the future, so long as any involvement of captive birds is done properly and their genetic line scrutinised so they are actually of a wild type ancestry. Let's have a look at the genetics behind the bird's head colours in a bit more detail. This research was published in Nature Communications in 2019. You've all heard of natural selection, but differences in head colour of the Gouldian finch cannot be explained by natural selection because the black and the red-headed birds continue to occur in wild populations. The differences in the occurrence of the black-headed and the red-headed Gouldian finch occur because of balancing selection. Female Gouldian finches of all colour types would ideally prefer to mate with a red-headed male, but red-headed males, being more aggressive, are more susceptible to social stresses. The black-headed males, with lower levels of stress hormones, can cope better in more competitive situations. Consequently, if advantages are cancelled out by concurrent disadvantages, the 2 colour types can be maintained in the population. This counterbalancing pressure reduces the chance of the red-headed bird becoming the commonest phenotype in the population, and consequently the black-headed bird also persists alongside of it. The spanner in the works here is the yellow-headed bird. Scientists are yet to decipher the exact genetic encoding for the yellow-headed phenotype in wild Gouldian finches. For these yellow-headed birds, a different gene, one that is not located on a sex chromosome, is controlling head pigmentation. But this gene, as I said, hasn't been found, and the forces that allow the yellow-headed bird to persist in the wild are still unclear.
So this is my setup for my finches. I always use natural perching, so these are real branches. And I always make sure that they're from species of tree that are not ornamental trees, which could potentially be toxic or poisonous, but are from native deciduous trees or from fruit trees. So these are apple branches. And these types of perching are really, really good for the bird's feet. They exercise the feet. They give them a range of different widths and a range of different lengths in the perching, which prevents bumblefoot, keeps the foot healthy, and ensures the birds can wear their nails down. The regular dowling type perches that you often get in passerine cages, so for things like canaries or zebra finches, where the dowling perch is all the same width all along, is not good for exercising the bird's feet and can lead to sores or pressure points forming on the plantar surface of the foot, that's the underneath of the foot, which can cause health problems and be uncomfortable to the birds. So I always find it best to use natural perches and to change those perches frequently to give variety to the birds in their enclosure. You can also see that I provide my birds with a lamp. This is an Arcadia bird lamp, and it's really important that species such as Australian finches get provided with extra UVB and UVA light in captivity. And that's because it helps them with some of the digestion and metabolism of key nutrients on their food. In fact, birds that are not provided with extra light in captivity can suffer nutritional deficiencies and poorer plumage colour. And one of the things that I just like to point out whilst I've got them on camera is you can see this rather strange head turning behaviour that they're doing. In small finches, that's an indication that they're stressed. And the reason that these birds are stressed at the moment is because I've opened the door of their cage and I've pointed my camera at them. So this is quite a nice example of a behavioural syndrome that can be linked to the animal's welfare state. So if you ever see this in a small perching bird, this consistent head turning, you know that there is something that is uncomfortable with in its surroundings and therefore you should change it. So I'm going to shut the door now and take my camera away so they stop performing this behaviour. And you can see now the door's closed, everybody has settled down and gone back to normal.
Let's have a look at the conservation status of the Gouldian finch out in the wild. I mentioned that the bird is quite threatened. Thankfully, conservation efforts over the last couple of years have moved the bird from endangered to near threatened. But there are still relatively conservative estimates over its population. And this has been estimated at around 2,500 mature individuals. There are more optimistic estimates that put the total population closer to 10,000 individuals. But there are various confounds around this number. A large proportion of the flocks that have been counted out in the wild are juveniles, which stand a smaller chance of survival to maturity. And there also seems to be a strong male sex bias within the populations too. There's also problems with the climate and seasonal changes in the population structure of the birds, which might suggest that populations fall to 1,000 mature adults during the wet season. The Gouldian finch seems quite a difficult species to count accurately out in the wild. Given the fact that it occurs in these different colour morphs that I've already explained, that the colour morphs are not necessarily socially compatible, and that there are female choice for particular head colours as a preference, this further reduces the number of breeding individuals in the population. So it's likely that these population estimates are towards the more limited end of the scale. Changes to the Gouldian finch habitat, invasive species, burning of habitats, human encroachment and climate change are also threatening the bird's range. This is the National Recovery Plan for the Gouldian finch, as published by the Australian government. And you can see in the previous example the range of the bird in Australia currently. The Gouldian finch is listed by the Australian government as endangered under its Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act from 1999. And this is because the bird's former range was from the Cape York Peninsula in Queensland all the way through the northern half of the Northern Territory to the Kimberley mountain ranges of Western Australia. And this has severely contracted, as you can see from the map on the IUCN Red List. The IUCN recommends the mitigation of various threats to help in the conservation status of this bird. And you can see the problems that the Gouldian finch is facing from this table of key threats in this National Recovery Plan. The IUCN also suggests some practical techniques to bolstering the population out in the wild. For example, the installation of nest boxes to increase reproductive output in recovering populations, and extending the captive breeding program of the birds, evaluating its performance and the quality of the individuals involved along the way, in an attempt to promote recovery. Working with local people and farmers and those that manage the bush to prevent invasive species from damaging the habitat and to reduce the burning of quality habitats where the birds would feed would also make a big difference in allowing the Gouldian finch to spread out of the pockets that it's currently found within. Let's now have a look at some practical aspects of finch husbandry. I'm going to talk to you a bit about handling and looking at the birds more closely so you can see some of their more specific features. We'll also look at some of the sex differences that the Gouldian finch possesses. A good example of how to handle a small passerine bird is shown in this diagram from the WikiHow website.
Okay, so I've just caught my male finch for you so you can have a closer look at him. And I always hold them so their head rests between my two middle fingers. That way you've got hold of the bird's wings, you can check the underneath of the bird, and it's not going to fly away. It's also a comfortable position for the bird, and therefore you've got him securely. You can see that he has this beautiful red head, and he's got an ivory white bill with a red tip. And that red tip in a Gouldian finch is indicative that the male is coming into breeding condition. Whilst my bird has a red head, you also get them with black heads and yellow heads as well. And what you can do is when you have the bird in this position, is you could check the keel, the breastbone, and check the body condition of the bird, make sure the musculature is good, that the bird isn't too thin. And you can also check feet, and you can check the claws as well to make sure that they're not too long. And you'll note that these birds are sexually dimorphic, not only with the brighter colours of the male, but also he has this longer pointed tail, and the females don't have these two longer extensions to their tail feathers. So whenever you hold a passerine bird like this, you must make sure that you've got them securely, but not too tightly. You can't strangle a bird, i.e. you can't asphyxiate it because of the closed cartilaginous rings around its neck, but you can crush them. So you need to make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on the bird, and you need to keep a watch on it so that it doesn't start panting or laboured breathing. Okay folks, so now I've got one of my female finches. I hope you can see that her head is a much duller colour, and her bill has the kind of dark grey edge to it, and the white ivory colour is not as vibrant. And she doesn't have the really elongated tail feathers, and the yellow colour on her belly and the purple colour on her breast is much more muted than in the male. So one of the things that you can look at in a female bird when she's coming into breeding season is to see where her brood patch is. And her brood patch is an area of highly vascularized skin
that's clear of feathers, and she uses that to press against her eggs when she incubates them to keep them warm. So I'm going to have a go at showing you where her brood patch would be and how you can check for it on camera. Okay, so you would hold the bird in the regular position and you would turn her upside down so you can see her belly. Get her wings and feet out of the way. And then you would blow along here. And it's not coming out very well, but right in the middle of her breast, I'm just going to part the feathers. I hope you can see some highly vascularized skin. That is her brood patch. So a bird coming into the breeding condition would have that patch of bare skin. Feathers grow in tracts across the bird's skin. They're not contiguous across all of the body. And the brood patch is an essential part of how the bird is able to incubate and rear its youngsters. So underneath her outer contour feathers, so the green ones that are there for keeping her streamlined, aerodynamic, we've got her down, and her down, which you can see in areas where the feathers grow, this is hard to do, is grey. But that brood patch is completely clear of down. It's completely bare skin. So I'll pop her back now, and then what we'll do is we'll have a look at some other aspects of their husbandry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the bird's diet. This is their staple diet. It's trill, which is just a brand of commercial pet bird seed, particularly used for budgies and small finches. Trill contains a mixture of different grains, so there's red and yellow and white millet, as well as some canary seed in there as well. And there's also a small biscuit, which makes the diet complete. And that's really important for birds like Gouldian finches. As I mentioned before, they have specific nutrient requirements because of where they come from in the Australian outback. And particularly calcium and vitamin D are essential to the regular functioning of their bodies. So I always use trill as the basic portion of the food that the birds get ad lib. Then in the middle here, we've got egg biscuit, which I feed to the birds dry, but you can do that wet, particularly if the birds are feeding youngsters. And egg food is really high in protein, and again for Gouldian finches, which can be susceptible to nutritional problems in captivity and can sometimes be picky eaters, egg food is a really nice way of ensuring they're getting the calorific content they need, particularly at certain physiological states, like when they're molting. And then finally, I've got a treat for the birds, which is yellow millet. And millet is just something that you can find in your regular pet store, which you hang as a large spray inside of the cage for the birds to feed on. I don't give the birds millet all of the time because it can be fattening, and I don't want them to eat the millet in place of eating the trill, which is the more complete diet. But I do provide them with ad lib millet when they are nesting, and I provide them with ad lib egg food when they're nesting, because then I know that any added calorific content they need whilst they're incubating or raising chicks, they're going to get regardless of what type of diet is provided. So I'm just going to show you now how much they love their egg food. So I'm going to put them some egg food in their cage and we will see what they do.
I wouldn't normally do this in day-to-day husbandry, but for this practical, I've just popped the tub of egg food above another food bowl. And the reason I wouldn't normally do that is because I don't want the birds landing on that yellow pot and then their droppings or spoiled food falling in the food bowl that's directly underneath. So normally I would pop their food bowl for the egg food much higher up that allows them to work for it. But for an easy way of me to film this, I've popped it where you can see it. So the egg food is a really highly valued resource for the finches. And you can see that the minute that I put the egg food in, they're already investigating what's there. And a handy tip for you is that if you find that the birds have picked out all of their favourite bits and it looks a little bit dusty in the bowl, just give it a shake and a fluff up, and you'll find that the birds go back to it and will resume eating what's already there. That saves you wasting the egg food, which can be quite expensive. As well as the egg food, I also like to give my birds enrichment. So what I have done here is laid out 3 millet sprays, and I've set up my GoPro camera and attached it to the side of the cage, so I can leave the finches alone for a bit and you can see what they do. Millet is excellent enrichment for the birds, particularly if you present it on these long sprays where they have to clamber around and be a little bit acrobatic so they can forage for the seeds. Always make sure that you clear up the husks from the millet after the birds have finished eating. It can be quite dusty and it can go everywhere, and you don't want millet husks falling into other food containers and maybe covering over other available food. That's why normally I wouldn't be hanging my millet around the other food bowls. The Gouldian finch, whilst it's a desert species, also requires fresh water. And I provide my birds with a standard budgie tube drinker, so they always have access to fresh water for drinking. And I also provide them with an open stainless steel bowl that attaches to the side of the enclosure, because they do also like a bath. And in fact, in the wild, Gouldian finches will naturally congregate around water sources, both for drinking and bathing, but also for social communication too. Not only is millet really good for enrichment, but it's also helpful for bringing birds into breeding condition too. The millet that you can see the birds eating at the moment is standard yellow millet that you can buy at any pet shop. But a whole range of different millet seeds exists, from red millet to white millet. And these different millet seeds contain different levels of protein, fat, and energy. So if you're looking to bring birds into the breeding condition, provide them with some of these higher energy millets, particularly that contain more protein. Their feathers, when they molt, will go through in a better condition, and they'll be in a better overall body score for laying eggs and feeding chicks. I'm not breeding these birds at the moment, and that's because they are a brother and 2 sisters. That's why I don't have my nest box in there, and that's why I haven't provided them with any nesting material. But what I will now show you is the setup that I have when I have bred finches in the past. And these 3 are my own progeny that I've had from a previous pair. Just before I do that, here's a photograph from the wild. In fact, the credit on this photograph is one of the key authors of the papers that I've already talked about Gouldian finch behaviour. And it shows the importance of water, not only for drinking and bathing, but also for the social environment and the communication between birds. As a flock-dwelling species, you should never, ever, ever keep a Gouldian finch by itself. It must have social companionship.
Here is the nest box that I use for my Gouldian finches. It's a standard finch-sized nest box, quite small, with an opening lid. And if you look inside, you can see the nesting pan on the floor has a depression in the middle, and that keeps all of the eggs in one place. I give the finches a range of nesting materials and they build their own nests. This type of nest box is really useful because you can attach it to various parts of the cage, and it's really easy to clean and keep maintained once the birds have done nesting.
So here's a photograph from a few years back from when I did have a breeding pair. The female is a black-headed bird and the male is one of those rarer yellow-headed birds. And this pair were really compatible and they raised successfully a number of chicks. Gouldian finches can be awful parents, and lots of breeders will foster rear the eggs to another species, the Bengalese finch, which makes an excellent foster parent and is very, very good at rearing chicks. If you do ever think about breeding Gouldian finches, and you do foster rear them, you must be aware that they're highly susceptible to air sac mites. And the Bengalese finch will carry these mites, but won't show any clinical signs. So do seek veterinary treatment for specific anti-parasitic medicines if you have any Gouldian finches with signs of laboured breeding, it's probably down to air sac mites. So here is my breeding male from a few years ago, and you can see I've provided him with some grasses for nesting material. He sat on top of my nest box, which I place in the highest point of the cage so the birds feel secure. The nesting material I've used in the past has been pre-packaged guinea pig or rabbit bedding, which I've then baked in the oven at a very low temperature to further sterilise it. I've also collected long grass heads and chopped them up, again baking them in the oven to make sure they're sterile. And I pile the nesting material on the floor of the cage and I allow the birds to pick through it. A good sign that the birds are ready for nesting is when the male starts investigating the nest box and starts searching around the cage looking for suitable nesting material. You'll also see him perform his courtship display, which is a relatively thin song performed as he bounces up and down in front of the female. So he's now looking into the nest hole of the nest box, and he's going to take in that nesting material and wind it round into a small cup-like nest on the floor of the box. The chances are that the nest itself will disintegrate over time, but that pan that I showed you, that indentation in the bottom of the nest box, will keep all of the birds in one place. One of my female Gouldian finches had a habit of laying too many eggs that could fit under her body. So if you do breed them, keep a watchful eye on the number of eggs that are being laid, and maybe remove some so that she can incubate a number that she can actually sit on, and then the birds aren't struggling to feed far too many chicks. You'll get better quality chicks that are looked after in a better manner by their parents if you reduce the number of eggs that she can actually sit on. And here is one of my chicks as a newly fledged juvenile from a few years back. And this is the male that I've been using in this practical demonstration. I hope you can see that he has the most amazingly coloured beak. And on the sides of his beak are small blue and yellow patches that glisten in the light. This is an incredible evolutionary adaptation that allows the parents to find the gaping mouths of the bird when it's a youngster in the nest and provide the food directly into his or her beak. And because Gouldians are a cavity nesting species, it's dark inside that nesting cavity, so these shiny patches and the contrast of the black and white inside of the bird's beak allow the parents to see where the small gaping mouths of their chicks are and feed them accordingly. And juvenile Gouldian finches have that grubby olive grey-green colour until they grow through into their adult plumage. And here they are now, as I've shown you previously, as adult birds in their full adult plumage. I mentioned that Gouldian finches can be susceptible to air sac mites, so it's important to keep them scrupulously clean. I clean all of my perches and I change my perches regularly too. I prevent any build-up of droppings around the cage, and once a week I wash down the bars of the cage to remove any droppings that might have occurred. I wash all of my food pots and I change their water daily. Some breeders and keepers like to mix their Gouldian finches with other species, and it's fine to do this with compatible species, such as other Australian grass finches that occur in their range. Personally, I wouldn't mix Gouldian finches with larger aviary birds that might bully them, carry diseases, or monopolise resources. They can be incredibly sensitive birds, and I've always found I've had the best success with them when I've kept them in small family groups.
And just to show you how little they are bothered after that practical, here they are all tucking into their millet. So this has given you a bit of an opportunity to see some of the husbandry methods used for small passerine birds, and especially for species that we might be keeping in aviculture quite commonly, both in zoos and in the pet trade as well. So it's important to always consider the wild ecology of the animal, regardless of where it's being kept, and make sure that it's being kept in an appropriate manner according to its species biology. So from me and my Gouldian finches, thanks very much, and I hope you've enjoyed looking a bit into their lives.